Hi all, today we will discuss about a Spring Boot interview question. So first question is what is a Spring Boot? So you can see there are multiple things there related for Spring Boot, why we use Spring Boot, what is a Spring Boot. Second question will ask like what are the advantages of a Spring Boot. So you can see these all are the advantages are there while we used a Spring Boot. So we can see all the advantages has mentioned here. Third question will ask what are the disadvantages. Suppose some of the advantage is there, but there will be some disadvantage. So this is the disadvantage of a Spring Boot while we used Spring Boot. Then some of the interviewer will ask like what is opinionated, why we use opinionated, where to use opinionated. So for these questions we have these answers. And the fifth questions, some of the interviewer will ask like how does it work, how does it know what to configure. So there is a auto configurations, how to implement and where to work. So this is the fifth questions will ask. Sixth questions will be there somewhere like how are the property defined, where to define the property. So that you can mention by the following ways to define a property in a Spring Boot. Seventh questions will ask like what is the difference between embedded container and what embedded container and or there is a multiple difference are there that is mentioned there. Other questions will ask like eighth, what embedded container does Spring Boot support? There is some internal embedded containers which will be supported by the Spring Boot, that is this one, and by default port will be 8080. Then other questions will ask like questions, enable auto configurations, what does @enable auto configurations, how about @spring applications, Spring Boot applications will work. So that you can see there is some examples which have mentioned here, through that you can also see enable auto configurations, component skins. So in @spring boot applications will support these three annotations internally. Then other questions will ask by the interviewer, what is a Spring Boot starter POM, why is it useful? So Spring Boot starter in POM, why we used, so for that you can mention this answer. Then other questions will ask, Spring Boot support both Java property and YAML file. Would you recognize and understand them if you saw them? So Java property file also will be supported and YAML. So you can, how you will recognize. So that application property file will be their application.property and YAML file will be .yaml, so that you can recognize. Can you control logging with a Spring Boot? How? So that type of questions also will ask. Customization default configuration login, how you will configure the default configuration logging level. So these all are the logging configurations where we can use, what are the framework we can use for the logging, like log4j, log4j2, logging, logback, and how you will add the info, debug and others. Then other question will ask how to reload my changes in a Spring Boot without saving or restarting the server. So while you node, then you can have a Spring loaders will be there. Through that we can automatically start all the changes which we have done, the changes in a Spring Boot, all the automatically will be restarted and loaded. Or we have DevOps dev tools also there, Spring Boot dev tools, so that dependency you can add or mention optional true. Then other questions will ask what is actuator in a Spring Boot, that also you can tell why we use actuator, where to use actuator, when to use actuator. Then other question will ask like how to run a Spring Boot application to the custom port, where do we need to change the custom port. Then other questions will ask like how to implement security, have you implemented before security in Spring Boot? You can ask them like what type of security you are asking, either JWT, Okta, and another. Yeah. So while we use any type of security, then you can add the Spring Boot starter security and then add the features. Then other question will ask what are the configuration file name used by Spring Boot, so that you can mention this configuration file name, either property file will be there. How to implement a Spring Web in a Spring Boot. We can also implement a Spring Web in a Spring Boot applications. So how you will do? We have a enable web MVC annotation that we can use. Other will have a meta public resource, meta resource that you can use, another thing. How to configure data source in a Spring Boot. So data source, while you need to connect any database or any type of other database, so that you need to clear declaration of the data source in a property file. So you need to add the dependency, either JPA or JDBC started data, JPA started JDBC, and add the property. Then they will ask like what is YAML, when to use YAML. So YAML is a markup language which is used for the property alternative of the property file. Then again you will ask what is YAML, and other what is the difference between property file, application.property. Then some of the other questions will be asked by the interviewer, like what are the various features of a Spring Boot. We can use a web application, applications listener, admin, externalization, property, YAML supports, logging, securities, and all. So these all are the external features which we used in a Spring Boot. Then they will ask what is the reason to have a Spring Boot Maven module. Then other question will ask how to make a Spring Boot venture utilizing a Spring initializer. So that also you can tell. And then other question will ask like what to dev tools in a Spring Boot Maven, which will be restarted the changes automatically, and then all. Then again he will ask some of the questions like what does a Spring Boot starter form means, why it is useful. We already discussed what is actuator, when to use actuator. Then what is the configuration file name used by Spring Boot, what is a Spring Boot opinionated is used. Then what is esteemed property in a Spring Boot. What is the Spring configuration file name which is used in a Spring Boot. That type of questions mostly they will ask while you have an interview in any of the organizations. So would you able to use Spring Boot with application which is not using a Spring? So no, we can't use. Spring Boot will be applicable only in a Spring only. So what is the name of configuration file which is used in a Spring Boot? How might you implemented a Spring security in a Spring Boot? Web security configure adapter that will be there. JWT, Okta, UAA token, two-factor authentication that you can use. Would you able to control logging in a Spring Boot? Yes, we can able to log in, control the logged in. What is the difference between embedded container and WAR file? What does a Spring security means? Why we use a Spring security? Then again he will ask what is aspect oriented programming, when to use aspect oriented programming. Then they will ask some of the questions like describe some of the Spring sub project brief, like JDBC have core, wave, ORM, AOP module, MVC. Like explain the difference between JPA and Hibernate, why we use a JPA, when to use Hibernate, when to use JPA. How to connect external database MySQL Oracle in Spring Boot. So there are 3-4 steps are there you can follow, and then add any type of external database connectivity. How to add custom JS code in Spring Boot. You can create a custom JS code and place it in this. Then list of minimum requirement of Spring Boot. What are the things is required minimum? So that Java, Spring, Maven, Gradle, Tomcat, Jetties. What is auto configuration? So Spring Boot starter web. So these all are the mostly questions which will be asking for the interviewer. We have collected and sharing with you these. Yeah, so that's it from my side. Thank you guys.